Welcome to the information session on LIFE 2021 Nature and Biodiversity Call for Proposals. During this information session, we will be talking about standard action projects and strategic nature projects. As for the standard action projects, LIFE is a program that relies on the initiative and project ideas of its applicants. We welcome project ideas that respond to the priorities of LIFE Nature and Biodiversity subprogram and support the objectives of the EU legislation and policy on nature and biodiversity. These priorities are reflected in two project topics. When preparing your application, you will need to choose one of them. My colleague will explain them in detail in a minute. I will just say that in all likelihood, most of your project ideas will fit very well in the first topic, nature and biodiversity. It is a very broad topic, and it responds to the key priorities of EU nature and biodiversity legislation and supports relevant objectives of the new EU biodiversity strategy. The second topic, nature governance, is very specific, and it has a rather narrow focus. Proposals under this topic must address compliance with EU nature and biodiversity legislation and access to justice. When preparing your application, please read carefully the description of both topics in the call document and choose only one of them. I strongly encourage you to read also additional conditions specified in the call document. This is a very useful section that explains under which conditions specific technical issues can be included in the LIFE projects. It covers issues such as land purchase, ex situ conservation, working outside Natura 2000, and much more. As for the strategic nature projects, these target the implementation of the prioritized action frameworks and possibly also other strategies and plans that are approved either at EU level or member state level by the competent authorities. These projects should be implemented at a large territorial scale with the involvement of all key stakeholders. They also require establishment of the coordination mechanism for the funding in order to cover measures that are complementary to SNaP to achieve full implementation of the prioritized action framework or another relevant strategy. So this is a very specific tool that can be used by national and regional authorities responsible for the targeted plans or strategies in order to achieve their implementation. My colleague will now share with you in detail the substance and the priorities for both standard action projects and strategic nature projects. I wish you good luck and look forward to receiving your project proposals.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Frank Vassen. I'm working for the Nature Unit in DG Environment. And this is a pre-recorded presentation, and I have the pleasure to present the priority topics for standard action projects in the topics document that is annexed to the multi-annual work program. However, I will also say a few words about the contents of a multi-annual work program, and in particular about the SNaPs, for which there is nothing in the topics document, and the only description that we have so far is in the multi-annual work program itself. But let's start with standard action projects, the SAPs. And for the SAPs, we actually have in the document two main types of projects. And the first one is what is now under the title Smart and Outcome-Based Implementation of the Nature and Biodiversity Legislation, which is the Birds and Habitats Directive and the Invasive Alien Species Regulation, or targets of the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And we expect that the vast majority of a budget for SAPs will be spent on this, which means that most of the projects should really focus on concrete outcomes in terms of conservation of species and habitats, or in terms of targets under the EU Biodiversity Strategy. And then we have a second component, which is actually much smaller in budgetary terms, which is something really specific. It is about nature and biodiversity related compliance assurance and access to justice in relation to nature and biodiversity legislation. So this is a very specific focus, and in fact the difference here is that also we have taken this out of the normal selection procedure because these projects obviously do not need to be outcome-based. They're much more about specific processes that need to be set up. Next slide then is that a bit more information about what these smart and outcome-based projects are about. And in fact, I think most of you have followed the discussions on this, but I'm reminding it that we have two areas of intervention. One is called Space for Nature and the other is called Safeguarding Our Species. And the Space for Nature one is of course probably the more important one, because this is about improving the condition of land for conservation, both inside and outside Natura 2000, in relation to the legislation and the biodiversity strategy targets. And then the Safeguarding Our Species component is much more specific. It is about improving the status of certain species for actions that cannot be covered by the Space for Nature component, but we'll come back later to that. And then the two policy priorities, I think that's already been mentioned, are on one hand the support to the implementation of the existing EU legislation, which is the Birds and Habitats Directive and the Invasive Alien Species Regulation. And then the second one is the support to the targets under the new EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And here, this is particularly about the Trans-European Nature Network and the EU Nature Restoration Plan, which are the two main out of the four big chapters of a strategy. And the other ones are actually more strategic and mostly relate to work by the Commission itself, or are much wider than nature and biodiversity on one hand, and on the other are related to the external component, which is not covered by the LIFE regulation. So this is an overview table that you will also find in the topics document. And basically what you have to keep in mind here is that any proposal that is falling in at least one of the two areas of intervention, so Space for Nature and or Safeguarding Our Species, and at least one of the two policy priority areas, could in principle be financed to a standard action project, a SAP under Life, Nature and Biodiversity. So the two areas of intervention, what are they? A bit more in detail. Space for Nature is actually anything that is related to improving the condition of habitats or species through area-based conservation or restoration measures. This is something that LIFE has been financing extensively over the last 25 years, and that we are going to continue to support as a priority also under the new program. And a few examples are given in the topics document. Of course, this is about projects for restoring or improving habitats or habitats of species. It is not limited to Natura 2000. It can be taking place outside. It is not limited to terrestrial. It can be marine. It is actually not even limited entirely to the EU territory, because it may also, in certain cases, cover outermost territories. There is also a clear link to some of the biodiversity strategy targets in terms of creating additional protected areas or improving the focus of and the contribution of existing protected areas, but also ecological corridors or green infrastructure. So it's actually quite wide, and it also includes testing or demonstration, but of course also best practice measures, etc. The second part, Safeguarding Our Species, is, as I said, more specific. It is generally about improving the condition of species, but in certain cases it may also be specifically related to reducing the negative impact of certain species when we talk about, in particular, invasive alien species. And we are not prescriptive in terms of the types of measures, because there is a wide range of measures that are potentially needed to improve the status of a species or to reduce the impact of the invasive alien species. And basically this mirrors very much what has been done so far in terms of species conservation measures under the LIFE program, but with a little bit of extension, as I will show later on. And of course, so the wonderful condition both for Space for Nature and safeguarding our species is that the projects need to be smart. And SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time-bound, which means that you really need to, or the applicants really need to clarify what the project is about and what is the expected result in terms of species or habitats that it is focusing on. And having this precondition for all projects will also allow us to make a content-based prioritization. That's why we insisted very much on that. And it will allow us to say, well, if the project is focusing on species and habitats that are in a worse conservation status, they should be considered as a higher priority for life support, and vice versa. If we have information that a species is either in favorable conservation status or secure under the birds reporting, the birds red list, or even for other red listed species, if it is in a secure or least concern status, it would be a lower priority for funding. Nothing is excluded here. So even species that are in a good status or in a low extinction risk may still be eligible for life support. But as you know, the budget that we have is limited, and this is one of the aspects on which the prioritization of the projects will be done. So the status, the known status of species and habitats, and we have a number of sources for this information, which is first of all, it's the EU, the reporting by the member states under the Birds and Habitats Directive, but also, as I will come back later on that, there is also a stronger focus on species and habitats not covered by the nature directives. For those, there is also a wealth of information available, and in particular for the EU red lists of species and habitats. And then for the very specific case of EU outermost regions and OCTs, it is then replaced by the global IUCN red list information, provided, of course, that this is available at the time the proposal is submitted. And I just wanted to remind you that, in fact, this prioritization is also reflected in the multi-annual work program when it comes to the co-funding rates. But you shouldn't confuse the two. The co-funding rate is something that is really fixed, whereas the prioritization in terms of the conservation status that I just mentioned is about prioritizing species for the selection. But on the co-funding rate, I think it's good to explain that here also, because this is very relevant for the SAPs. It's actually specific to the SAPs. The possibility for projects to be covered by 75% EU co-funding has actually increased compared to the previous LIFE program. At least that is what we have suggested in the multi-annual work program. And as you might know, in the past, this possibility was restricted to habitats and species that were listed as priority species in the relevant annexes 1 and 2 of the Habitats Directive, or as for certain bird species, and as there are no priority bird species in the Birds Directive, we had a list of bird species that are priority for funding that have to be determined by the ONIS committee. And that exercise has actually very recently been updated. So we have a brand new list of bird species as considered as priority for funding by the ONIS committee. And, well, unfortunately, due to the overall negative trend for many species, the list is much broader than it used to be in the past. But we also managed to withdraw certain species because their conservation status is now much better. But it's not only anymore about these priority species. Now we have enlarged this possibility of 75% co-funding also to habitats and species, the conservation status of which is in an unfavorable bad and declining situation, both at the national and the biogeographical level. And we have even gone further than that, because we have extended the possibility for 75% co-funding also to species and habitats that are not covered by the nature directives, provided there is an information in a European red list showing that these species are endangered or worse, and in fact there are many species that are falling into that situation. So thematically this is a major extension of the scope of the program, and in fact we know that quite a number of applicants are interested in that opportunity for higher co-funding for these endangered species. And knowing that the co-funding rate is very often the limiting factor, this might actually, we need to see how this is reflected in the future by the type of applications that we get. And then very specifically, as you know, the SAP funding also covers the outermost region and OCTs, which are not covered by the European red lists. And there basically the same principle applies, but on the basis of a global IUCN red list. And this is not an unequal treatment because many of the species in these outermost regions are endemics. So it is really the local status that is the same as the global red list status in this case. But in any case, whenever we have such applications asking for 75%, the applicants will need to argue that in their proposal that all actions are clearly tailored towards these species and habitats, and that it is not a mixed proposal also covering other species and habitats. If that would be the case, the maximum would be 67%, sorry. But even then, there must be a focus on the priority, non-priority habitats, and in all other cases, the maximum rate would be 16%. Another issue that is very often coming up is the question, what about this previous rules in life regulation about the need to have demonstration and innovation in the projects? Well, I think it was always clear that best practice was possible. In the past, this was mainly restricted to the implementation of the birds and habitats in Natura 2000. This is not anymore the case. Actually, best practice is possible also for in other situations, or at least this has been clarified now. And in some cases, best practice is what we need. In others, demonstration or even demonstration of innovative practices or testing. And there is no preference for one or the other. And just to mention that, every type of project is possible. And as in the past, we expect that the best practice conservation management projects will constitute the bulk of the life funding for the SAPs. But every project will basically be evaluated by its own merits. So whether it's best practice or innovation or demonstration. Okay, now we come to the second part, which is the policy priorities, which are outlined in the topics document, and there are two big priority areas. The first one is in relation to the EU nature legislation and the invasive alien species regulation, and the other on the biodiversity strategy. And by the way, all the information that you see here is also included in the topics document, so you can read it there again later on. Under the nature legislation, we have made a clear link to the national or regional prioritized action frameworks, because most member states should by now have submitted their PAFs. So these are planning tools for the implementation of the directives for the next 7 years. And in fact, we are almost there. Most member states have indeed submitted PAFs. And when we have proposals that are suggesting improving the conservation status or trends of species and habitats of EU importance, and these actions are outlined in the PAFs, then this is clearly in itself a reason to prioritize the proposal according to the topics document. And here we give a few examples what it means for Space for Nature. This is very much linked to actions for the implementation of conservation objectives for existing Natura 2000 sites. In particular, where there are clearly established conservation objectives that improve the condition of species and habitats for the sites where the species for the species and habitats for which the sites have been designated. And then for protecting our species, we suggest that focus on looking at species and habitats that are in particular subject to direct persecution, and where we have stakeholder conflicts and where there is a need for improving the acceptance and promoting coexistence. And a good example of this are, of course, all the issues that we have with large carnivores. And I think it makes sense to have this as a specific focus here, because some of these species are actually not in a bad conservation status. Actually, they are very often recovering at the EU scale, and sometimes they are already in a better status at the national level. But there is still a need to work on the reduction of stakeholder conflicts and the acceptance for these species. So this is a bit an exception, if you may say so, of the principle that we will focus on species and habitats in the worst conservation status. And this is because there is a very specific need to this. And then you might ask, well, what about the species that are in a bad conservation status but that are not subject to this? We will come back to this because there is a target under the biodiversity strategy which is related to this 30% status improvement target for habitats and species, where we would expect that other species that are in an unfavorable status and for which there is a clear commitment for improvement are also covered. So I think that with this arrangement we would cover all the meaningful priorities, either on for the species, either on where there is a link to the stakeholder conflicts or when it is about genuinely an issue of conservation status. We are still here under the EU nature legislation only, so this is really the baseline here is then the Article 17 data or the Article 12 data under the Birds Directive. And then we come to the second big chapter of EU nature and biodiversity legislation at the EU level, which is the invasive alien species regulation, where our colleagues in Unit D2 have suggested the following, and we understand that you have accepted this. So the priority is given to proposals that address invasive alien species that are already included in the list of invasive alien species of union concern. But there is also a possibility to look at invasive alien species of regional concern pursuant to that regulation. So in all these cases are covered, but actually we go a bit further because we say priority is also given to proposals addressing other invasive alien species where they affect the conservation status or trends of species and habitats of EU importance, or other threatened species, and there the information, the baseline would of course be the IUCN information or the global one for species outside the EU territory. So I think this matches very well the logic that I have presented before in terms of prioritization. Okay, now as you know, we have the new EU biodiversity strategy, and there is a lot of relevant targets here for which there is a need to support, including from the LIFE program. This is complementary to the regulatory, so to the directives and regulations that I just presented. And in fact, we have suggested that not all targets should be directly covered by LIFE because some of them are very obviously covered by other EU funding instruments, such as the one on pesticides on agricultural land. And these are the ones here that that we suggested as priority areas for LIFE funding under the biodiversity strategy. And I will now pass them quickly one by one and explain a bit what they are about. The first one is about this target under the strategy to have by 2030 30% of all EU area, both land and sea, to be covered by protected areas, and therefore under the LIFE funding, priority would be given to proposals that would focus their activities on increasing the share of EU land or marine area under protection. Of course, this needs to respect the guidelines for the definition of what is a protected area, which are currently still under development, but which should be finalized by the end of the year. And that will also include certain areas that are not strict, let's say that are not legally protected, but such as the OECMs or certain urban areas. But more about this, I would refer to the guidelines that are currently under development. And then it's not only about the protected areas themselves, but also about issues such as their resilience, their effective management, of course, very important, and the connectivity, all of which can also be the subject of prioritization under life, nature, and biodiversity if they are clearly linked to this target under the strategy. And then you have to keep in mind that it's not just about the 30%. There is also a target saying that, well, 10% of the EU land and sea, or 1/3 of these protected areas, these 30%, should be strictly protected. And that is both the case for land and marine areas, and projects that would support the enlargement of protected areas, of strictly protected areas, would therefore also be considered as a priority for funding. But there again, keep an eye on the guidance document, on the current discussions, and look at the document once it is finalized, because the definition of what is strict protection is currently subject to a heated debate, and we hope that by the end of the year we have a fixed definition that is agreed by all, or at least most of the stakeholders. And that will not only include, let's say, non-intervention areas, but also typically, at least I would say, those habitats or those areas with habitats that require an active management, such as species-rich grasslands and others, provided there is really a strong legal protection for these. Okay, so far about the protected area target. The EU Nature Restoration Plan is the second big chapter of the biodiversity strategy, and we have a very specific target there, which is closely linked to the EU Birds and Habitats Directive, and it says that on the basis of a reporting for 2019, we know that a certain share of a species are not in favorable conservation status. Actually, it's a very high share, and by 2030, what we want to achieve is that there is no more deterioration for any of these species, but in addition that for 30% of these species that are not in favorable conservation status, there should be a significant improvement, so either a positive trend, a strongly positive trend, or the achievement of favorable conservation status. And there is a similar target for the birds with a slightly different wording, but the meaning is basically the same. So as regards this target, which is a national level target that every member state basically should be committed to implement, we expect that in the course of 2022, at the latest, member states will come up with their pledges in terms of what they want to do in terms of either halting the decline or achieving an improvement. And everything that would be clearly related to these pledges will then become a priority for life funding. And of course, you will immediately recognize that there is an incentive link here between the promotion of the pledges and the prioritization under the LIFE program, in particular the SAPs. The strategy also mentions that we should restore degraded and carbon-rich ecosystems and prevent and reduce the impact of natural disasters, in particular in relation to climate change. And in fact, as you know, there is a lot of win-wins to be achieved between restoring nature and on one hand and climate adaptation or mitigation on the other hand. And the first thing that comes to our mind is the restoration of or protection of degraded or carbon-rich ecosystems, in particular forests, but also peat bogs, etc. So there's a lot of these habitats, including some marine ones, which the restoration of which is also then considered as a priority for life support. And in relation to climate adaptation, I think the key issue is the reduction of natural disasters through river restoration or working in coastal areas. And there is a lot of win-wins there as well to be achieved between restoring nature, protecting species and habitats, improving their status, and reducing the risk of catastrophic flooding, for example, in the case of river restoration. So this is a very specific feature target of the biodiversity strategy. And keep in mind that there is currently a development. The Commission should come up by the end of the year with a proposal for legally binding restoration targets. This is not something that we have mentioned in itself as a priority topic under the current multi-annual work program. Why is that? Well, the work program is for the first 4 years of a program, and we only expect that the regulation or the directive, depending on what it will be, is adopted at the very end of this multi-annual work program. So this is probably something to look at for the second part of the life period, rather, which is then from 25 to 27, when we will have a new multi-annual work program and presumably also revised topics. There is a specific focus on improving the health and resilience of managed forests. So here we are leaving the context of protected areas and projects that would demonstrate closer to close to nature forestry practices. And the topic document clearly defines what is meant by that, would then be a priority for life funding as well. We have a EU we have an EU pollinators strategy, and actions for pollinators, certain actions at least, as outlined in the topics document, will be priorities for life funding. And very often this is linked to the restoration of the habitat of these species. And actually by now we have a EU red list of pollinators, which can then be also a reference for prioritization of measures for certain pollinator species. But here we also talk about the restoration of relevant, let's say, habitats that are relevant for pollinators. And there's a lot of habitats under the Nature Directive, in particular, which are important for pollinators. Think about the calcareous grasslands. So here what the topics document says, that the proposal should clearly make a link to the presence of these pollinators and perhaps look more specifically on their ecological requirements when it comes to the restoration of these areas. Under the biodiversity strategy, there are quite a number of targets that are linked to agricultural land, improving its condition, restoring nature on agricultural land. Of course, a lot of these should be primarily funded to the CAP strategic plans. But we think there is still some room for some additional measures that might be more difficult to finance under the CAP. And this is particularly the case for certain demonstration actions. And we have had some very interesting projects in the past that have actually tested or demonstrated, for example, agri-environmental measures. And some of these were actually successful and have been transposed into national rural development programs or now in the CAP strategic plans. So we hope that there is, or we think there is still an opportunity to continue the financing, the support to such demonstration projects, for example, for new agri-environment measures, as a complement to the funding under the CAP, but also to bring these measures then hopefully later on into the CAP, because when it comes to agricultural land, there is often the potential for a large-scale application of these measures. So testing such measures is something that we would encourage under the LIFE program through the prioritization here. Greening of urban and peri-urban areas is something that we have not focused much in the past, but I think there is an increasing recognition that we need to focus more and we need to look more into the biodiversity of urban areas. And there is a huge demand because most of EU citizens and an increasing share of the citizens are moving towards cities, and they are asking for more support to biodiversity in urban areas through green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And this is another priority topic that we have suggested and that you have agreed on in the document. And then something really specific was suggested by the colleagues in the biodiversity unit is about the need for decision-making, in particular for private businesses, but also for public administrations, and the potential that accounting, ecosystems accounting, and integration of biodiversity values into their decision-making may have. And projects that are focusing on that target would also be considered as a priority for the SAP funding. So I think this was an overview of the priority topics. I know we have already discussed many of these in the past. I think the document is now stabilized, although I understand the multi-annual work program and the topics document is not yet finally adopted. We'll hope that the adoption will take place very soon so that this can be used as soon as possible for the first call for proposals. And now we come to the second part of second type of projects under strategic under the SAPs, the standard action projects, which is something really specific. It's about the compliance assurance and access to justice. So here there is really a much more narrow focus in terms of topics. It's about compliance and access to justice. And actually there is a whole range of points here which have been identified by our colleagues working on these topics, on which there is a need to work more on. And in fact, there will be a dedicated call for this kind of standard action projects. So a budget that is earmarked for this type of projects so that we have a guarantee that a sufficient number of these projects can be financed through life in the coming years. So I'm not so familiar with these topics in detail, but I think you can read them for yourself. And I would also invite you to consult the topics document where I copied this information from. So just to finalize on the topics document, I wanted to raise a few points which you need to be aware of. You might have noticed that we do not have any more pure communication projects or pure monitoring projects because of this focus on outcome-based. And actually, the reason why we did this is that we realized that with the relative allocation of a budget for different parts of life, including the SNaPs, I will come back to that now, but also BEST, the funding of life coordinators, and some other forms of funding. In fact, in reality, we don't have any strong increase of a budget for the standard action projects. So at the same time, we see that there is an increasing demand, and we therefore considered that it was necessary to focus the sub-funding on outcome. So what does it mean for projects, for other projects? Well, if they would be really strategic from a national or regional point of view, we would suggest that these activities for monitoring, for inventories, but also for communication should primarily be covered by the SNaPs, by the strategic nature projects. But in some cases, we might even consider a dedicated call for a very specific project under other projects, but that we would need then to agree with you, with a live committee, that this is really a priority for EU funding support. I think you have also noticed that we have now a stronger focus on species and habitats that are the most threatened in the worst conservation status. So it's not only anymore about the priority species, and that is both reflected in the prioritization and in the co-funding rates. I mentioned that in some cases we have some deviations from the basic principle, which have then been translated specifically in the topics. I mentioned the large carnivores in terms of conservation status, but also the urban greening or the integration of the value of nature, which are a bit outside the traditional scope of nature funding. But here we clearly emphasized on those to say, well, these are priorities now under the biodiversity strategy, and they deserve priority support for life. The next point I mentioned already, the need to focus and the fact that some actions should rather be covered by SNaPs and other projects rather than the SAPs, in particular monitoring, inventories, communication and awareness raising. But many of these actions can actually be part of a SAP as well. So if the focus of the standard action projects is an outcome and it is necessary to have specific actions on awareness raising, communication or monitoring, these are perfectly eligible within the frame of a project if they are necessary to achieve the objectives, but not anymore as standalone projects under SAPs. So this is an important change compared to the previous round. Okay, the last point I already mentioned as well, so that there is an opportunity for many of these actions to be covered by the SNaPs, in particular, of course, when they are really of strategic importance at national or regional level at which the SNaPs are taking place. Now we come to the SNaPs. We leave the topics document back to the multi-annual work program from where this information about the SNaPs is extracted. For the moment being, there is no other written document about the SNaPs. So this is our reference for the moment being. And you know the regulation says that SNaPs are there to support the achievement of union nature and biodiversity objectives by implementing coherent programs of actions in the member states, that might also mean the regions, to mainstream these objectives, but also to mobilize additional funding for these objectives, which is then called financial mainstreaming. And as you know, in the past, the nature integrated projects were very much focused on the prioritized action frameworks under the Habitats Directive. Well, now we suggest that it is not only anymore about the PAFs, but actually other programs should also be possible to cover other programs than the PAFs to the SNaPs. And specifically, we say, well, the SNaPs target the following strategies and plans, the PAFs, and other plans or strategies, including at regional, national, or even transnational level that implement EU nature or biodiversity policy or legislation. This is potentially wide, but I think you need to keep in mind that there is still a competition for the SNaP funding, and I think that there would still be an important focus on the PAFs, and in fact we know that there's a lot of countries that have still a lot of work to do in terms of implementing the PAFs. So a project that would purely focus on other topics but ignores the PAFs might be questionable, except of course if there is another SNaP for the PAFs. So I think we will still need to focus a bit on the importance of the PAFs, also because that is specifically requested in the LIFE regulation itself. But clearly from now on it is also wider, and a significant share of the budget of an individual SNaP may be allocated to objectives that are not strictly anymore related to the Birds and Habitats Directive and the PAFs. So what are the key measures to be covered by the SNaPs? Well, basically the SNaPs have been conceived as a complement to the traditional projects, and we suggested that the SNaPs should be quite flexible in terms of what kind of actions and what kind of costs can be covered, as long as there is a good reason for this. And it means that normally the concrete conservation measures should not be the focus of a SNaP. They may still be included if, in particular, where they cannot be supported to other EU funding programs. But we think that the real added value of a SNaPs is when it comes to the institutional support and the capacity building of the actors at the national or regional level, and of course their partners. We expect a significant partnership in each SNaP. And in practice, that might mean that a significant share of a SNaP budget might actually be allocated to staff costs or consultancy costs rather than costs for conservation measures, for example. And part of this is, of course, then to this new free stuff should be allocated to those tasks that are, let's say, neglected otherwise if there would be no SNaP, because the administration is already bound by all kinds of other requirements. So the idea here is really that the SNaP funding is used to finance additional, let's say, also personnel that could then do those actions that would otherwise not be feasible. And that includes in particular the mobilization of additional finance, on which very often we get the message from the member states that there is a gap there. And so putting additional stuff to that task is actually one of the factors that can really help mobilizing funding for nature and biodiversity, in particular from other EU funding instruments and programs. Now, one of the key requirements for each SNaP is that the authorities that are competent for nature and biodiversity and that are responsible for the PAF implementation are on board in the implementation of the project, either as applicants or, if that's not possible for some well-justified reasons, as associated beneficiaries, as was the case so far for the integrated projects. There are some key issues. I think most of you are aware of this, but I think it's good to remind them that, in fact, in principle, large countries, large member states could submit several SNaPs, but we would still encourage the larger member states to submit one single large SNaP. Of course, this will not be possible in all cases. We are aware of this. And 2 or even 3 SNaPs per member state are therefore still possible if duly justified. And this is, of course, the case in particular for large countries with multiple regions where perhaps a single SNaP might be difficult or cumbersome to manage, and where the responsibility for the implementation is mostly devolved to the regions. Another important issue is that we want the SNaPs to cover the widest possible share of the EU territory. So we would be looking critically at a SNaP that is only covering one region in a country with 20 different regions. And for such cases, we would strongly suggest that several regions team together for one bigger SNaP, as otherwise there is a clear risk that by the end of the life regulation, we would still have important parts of the EU not covered by a single SNaP. And we know that these multi-regional countries very often have a huge demand or need for this kind of strategic support. We would also encourage a transnational coordinated implementation between the member states. It doesn't necessarily mean that it must be a multinational SNaP. This is something that is possible, but it's not a requirement. But I think that in practice, this means that for every SNaP, there should be a certain budget allocated to the cooperation with other member states, or even the participation in transnational or EU process. And we will encourage very much the SNaPs, but also the ongoing IPs to become involved in the biogeographic process and to have a network of exchange where we can really discuss with them issues in particular in relation to the targets under the biodiversity strategy for 2030. And the implementation of the strategy, as you might know, will be the focus of the biogeographic process in the next years. And then another important point, while many integrated projects are still ongoing for a number of years, in fact, it is not impossible to have an overlap between a SNaP and an integrated project in a given member state or region. This is not excluded, but then it must be very clear that there is an added value and a complementarity of the IP funding with the one under the SNaP. Alternatively, you might also consider to wait until you have or you are approaching the completion of your IP before submitting then a SNaP, so that you have a seamless transition from the IP to the SNaP, if there is already one. And then, of course, the funding is limited, but contrary to the SAP funding, the funding for SNaPs has included an indicative allocations. So in principle, it means that a certain budget for SNaPs is reserved for every member state, and the allocation is actually quite simple. It is based on the size of the member states, and we suggested that member states fall into just 3 categories with coefficients then 1, 2, or 3. And you can see which country falls under which. This is based very much on the size, so less than 30,000 square kilometers, between 30 and 100, or more than 100. And the coefficient then is 1, 2, or 3. And what does it mean? Well, if the coefficient is 1, it would be, I mean, indicatively, for the moment, I must say, it would be an amount of, I think it's 10 million euros. If it's 2, it's 20 million euros, and if it's 3, it's 30 million euros. But that still needs to be confirmed in the near future. I hope this will be the case. And just to remind that, of course, if every country would submit a SNaP proposal in the first year, we would have a technical problem, and we would not be able to serve all countries. And therefore, we have to keep a system where the awarding of the SNaP grants will remain competitive. There is also another reason for this. We want to, of course, to have a certain quality and ambition in each of the SNaPs. And even if there would be no competition, still each SNaP submitted will be subject to a detailed evaluation and must achieve a certain minimum pass score in order to be financeable. So this is no change compared to the previous LIFE program and the integrated projects. So this is the end of my presentation. I thank you very much for your attention, and myself and my colleagues are now available for any additional question that you might have. Thank you very much.